Welcome to the Noakes Foundation website. I think that if you've gone through bits of the website by now, you'll realize why I'm giving this talk and how I went through a dietary epiphany that I followed for 33 years, a traditional diet that we were told was very healthy for you, and I discovered essentially it wasn't so good for me. And I've been writing and reading for the last 3 years, and the talk that I'm going to give today explains what I believe now are the problems with our dietary advice and what I think we need to do to change them. So to get to the topic of the talk is, what if our current dietary advice is all wrong? And I ask that question with emotion because I believe that the dietary advice that I started following in 1977, which suggested you have to cut fat from the diet and increase your carbohydrate intake, particularly increasing your grains and cereal intake, was certainly wrong for me, and I suspect it's wrong for a large percentage of many Western societies. So the key question in the nutritional sciences is, why do all mammals not eat the same foods? So if we look at these 4 animals, they eat completely different foods and they're highly specialized in what they eat. And what it turns out, in my view, is that why do all creatures or mammals on Earth not eat the same foods? And the answer, in my view, is that each species can eat only that for which it is genetically programmed as a consequence of its coevolution with a specific group of foodstuffs in a specific environment, producing a specific gut bacterial flora. And if that is true, then if you want to know what we should be eating, you just have to determine those foodstuffs with which we co-evolved. And then you'll know the foods for which that species is optimally adapted. And I was in the bush in South Africa a few weeks ago, and we came across this scene where lions were eating the carcass of a giraffe. And a couple of things are very apparent here. Firstly, the lions are all lean, despite the fact that they're the top predator. And so if there was no control, they'd be fat because they would just eat too much. The second point is, notice what they eat first. They eat the viscera of the animal first, the offal. And the third point, which isn't really recognized, is that they're in direct contact with the bacterial flora of that animal that they've killed. And in fact, if you look closely, I think they've actually eaten some of the intestine, and which means they will have been exposed and have ingested some of the bacteria that exist in the giraffe. So there's one of the points, that maybe if you go back into wild animals, you'll see they all eat a particular food with which they co-evolve, but it's more complex than that if you're a carnivore. And carnivores always eat the viscera first, which is what we don't do. And secondly, they are in contact with the intestinal flora of the animals that they kill, and so they must have co-evolved with those bacterial flora as well. One of the most important books in nutrition was written by Weston Price in the 1950s, and Weston Price in the early 1900s was working in Canada, and he noticed that the children, all of a sudden their teeth couldn't fit in their mouths. In other words, they had too many teeth for their mouth, and he wondered why it was, and he suggested it might well be because of dietary changes. So he decided to take himself and his wife on a tour of the world and find the populations which were continuing to eat the foods that they'd always eaten. And this cover of the book shows the faces of some of the people that he met and who continued to eat their traditional foods. And he said there were certain characteristics of these populations. Firstly, they had these beautiful broad faces. Secondly, they had perfect teeth, and their dental caries rate was below 1%. And thirdly, their teeth fitted in their mouths. So they had plenty of space in their jaws for all their teeth. But he noticed also how incredibly healthy they all were. And he noticed next was that as soon as the so-called white man's diet, or the Western industrial diet, arrived, particularly with sugar and wheat, this is what happened. Like the Indian, the Eskimo thrived as long as he was not blighted by the touch of modern civilization. But with it, like all primitives, and that's an unfortunate choice of term, he withers and dies. And we know that in Africa, that prior to the Western diet arriving in Africa, people were remarkably healthy and they didn't have the diseases that we have today, particularly diabetes, obesity, autoimmune diseases, and the cancers. And so these were the diseases that were absent when people were eating the so-called primitive diet: dental caries, obesity, diabetes, heart disease and stroke, most cancers, most intra-abdominal infections, most autoimmune diseases, and the range of neurological diseases, particularly those linked to dementia like Alzheimer's disease, but also multiple sclerosis. And so if those diseases were absent before the diet arrived that we eat today, then surely you have to make the conclusion that these diseases of civilization or urbanization are nutritionally based. And the reason we don't accept it is because we cannot comprehend that the primitives knew better than we do what to eat for optimal health. So that's the premise of Weston Price's work, and it's something that we really have to consider very seriously. And every day the evidence that this is true arises. We now know, for example, that cancer is not a disease of genetic mutation, it is a disease of nutrition. Cancer cells can only multiply and divide if they are given glucose. And the key change that occurs in the cancer cell to make it cancerous is that it increases its capacity to take up glucose. And that was known by Otto Warburg in 1931. He won the Nobel Prize for saying that cancer cells are completely different than normal cells because they can only burn glucose. So if you have a population that does not eat much carbohydrate and then you introduce carbohydrate, you would expect the cancer rates to be increased. And the evidence linking high carbohydrate diets to dementia grows all the time. And only this week, the book Grain Brain has been released, suggesting that grains particularly are related to the increasing rates of dementia in Western societies. So here's a picture of the cover of Weston Price's book, as well as a picture of Weston Price. And there's an Australian Aborigine who is incredibly healthy as long as he exists on his traditional foods. But if he were to go to live in Sydney or Brisbane or Adelaide and eat the white man's diet, then his health will deteriorate. And these were pictures from the book. On the left we have a young man from Congo showing perfect teeth and broad face. The same with New Zealand Maoris, the same with the Maasai. But once the Western diet comes, and that's the lowest picture, you see what happens. The dental caries develop, and this young man is going to die from dental infections leading to brain abscesses. So we have to know that if we were developing all those dental caries over the last few thousand years as a result of our diet, we wouldn't exist today, because modern medicine wasn't there to save us from all the complications of these bad dental caries. So that was a compelling story, that it was the change to the Western diet that is causing many, many diseases. And if we look back into the 1800s and find out who were the healthiest people in the world at the time, it turns out the Plains Indians in North America were, and they lived on one animal, the bison. And we know they were the healthiest because they were the tallest. So those are the Cheney, the Arapawa, the Crow, the Sioux, and the Blackfeet were significantly taller than all other populations, with perhaps the exception of the Australians. But if you think about the Australians in the 1800s, they were eating lamb because that was the animal that they took to Australia. So here are the population eating high-fat, high-protein diets and being extremely healthy. Unfortunately, what happened next was the genocide, which was caused by the destruction of the buffalo herds. And at one stage, there were 60 million buffalo in North America, and they were completely wiped out. And what was the consequence for the people who lived on these foods and who had become adapted to eat this type of food? Well, they were then exposed to the high carbohydrate, highly processed foods of the modern diet, and that's what happened. They became obese. And so what do we say? We blame them for being obese, but that's not the problem. The problem is that it's because their traditional foods were taken from them and replaced with foods that are completely inappropriate for people adapted to eating high-fat protein diets. And that's one of the paradoxes. The cause of obesity is so absolutely apparent, and we spend billions of dollars a year trying to explain what causes it, because we can't admit what the real cause was, that it was a change of our diets brought about by many other factors. And even if you take Western Europeans and look at them, it turns out that the mid-Victorians who lived between 1850 and 1870 were incredibly healthy. And these are some papers that were published recently showing that if you lived between 1850 and 1870 in Britain and you were working class, you had an incredibly good diet because food prices had come down, and so people could eat lots of high quality protein and fat as well as lots of vegetables, and they worked extremely hard. So here's a picture of the working class working in the mines, and they all look lean because that's what humans should look like, and they all had a life expectancy as long as we have today. And you have to remember that these people did not die of the diseases we die of, nor did they have access to medical care that we have today. And the reality is the only reason why we live as long as they do is because we die so slowly. We have these chronic illnesses which we treat with medications that don't prevent or cure the disease, but they just keep us hanging on. And so we take a long time to die. And so the life expectancy of people today is inflated compared to these people because they did not have access to medications that we have today, yet they lived as long as we do. And it's something we have to consider. And then we look at what they died from, and we see that if you lived in the 1880s, you died predominantly from other diseases, and I suspect those were injuries and other intercurrent illnesses. But the diseases of the circulatory system and cancers are the two smallest bars on the left. And on the right, they become the biggest bars. So 100 years ago, or 150 years ago, in Britain, people were not dying of circulatory disease and neoplasms, but they were eating a diet that was totally different from what we eat today. And you have to ask the question, what's caused it? And the answer seems pretty obvious, that those people were working just as hard, they were just as stressed, and they didn't have the medical support that we have, yet they outlived us and they didn't get these types of diseases. Human nutrition begins to change from vegetarianism to carnivory already 3.5 million years ago. And the trajectory of humans to become Homo sapiens is decided by carnivory. If we didn't become carnivores, we wouldn't be here today. And because we live in Africa, and particularly Southern Africa, it's important to remember that the cradle of humankind is probably East Africa or South Africa. And this skull is from the Tong child, which was discovered in 1924, and really was the first to show that the African continent was where humans evolved. Now, in one of the great paradoxes of my life, my parents left England at the end of the Second World War and came to live in Rhodesia, as it was then, in Zimbabwe. And we built a small little house next to this man here in the middle, and that is Dr. Trevor Jones. And Dr. Trevor Jones is shown here when he was still a medical student, and he's working with some of the great paleoanthropologists of Southern Africa. Now, what was really interesting about Dr. Trevor Jones was that he introduced Dr. Broom to the caves in Sterkfontein. And the Sterkfontein caves became the place where the great discoveries of pre-human fossil record in South Africa began. And he described a paper in which he described a new fossil primate from Sterkfontein, and they knew that as soon as you found those fossils, you would find humans, because they coexisted. And it did not take long before Raymond Dart, who was head of the department, became involved and interested, and they went to Sterkfontein, and very shortly thereafter, they discovered Mrs. Ples. And this is the real fossil of Mrs. Ples, and I was privileged to hold it, because that's my friend Francis Thackeray holding it there. And Mrs. Ples was discovered in 1947, and she's 2.1 million years old. And the key to Mrs. Ples is how small she was. This is a picture of her pelvis, and that's my watch. And we know now that Mrs. Ples, that's what she looked like, and she was 3 foot tall, and she weighed about 30 kilograms. And the question is, how did Mrs. Ples go from being the vegetarian that she was to being the Homo sapiens today, who is usually 5 to 6 foot tall, with a much bigger brain? And the answer is it was the development of carnivory, particularly, that made the difference. And the reality is Australopithecus africanus actually wasn't a full vegetarian, that already they were eating meat. And my friend, Dr. Francis Thackeray, in fact, was one of the first to show that as well. So this change occurred as humans became the best midday persistent hunters in the animal kingdom. And because we became such brilliant hunters, we were able to capture antelope particularly with a high fat and high protein bodies, and eating that food allowed us to develop our brains. And the paradox then is that for 3.5 million years we've done very well without being told what we should eat. Our health really deteriorated once we started listening to the experts telling us what we should be eating. So if you go back 2.8 million years ago to the savannah in southern Africa, this is what you would have found. You would have found Australopithecus africanus, although predominantly a tree dweller, also able to walk upright on the ground. And the problem was that the forest was disappearing at this time and being replaced by savanna. So the foods, the vegetarian type foods that Australopithecus was eating was disappearing, and either he had to learn to find a new food supply and get bigger, or he would basically disappear and be eaten by the animals that were eating them anyway. And so they would have started with capturing or finding food in the trees left there by the leopards. Eventually they would have had to take on the antelope. And what we think happened was that mammals with relatively poorer heat tolerance, like the antelope, can be captured by hominins with superior thermoregulatory capacity. So we believe that these Australopithecines and those who followed them became brilliant runners and were able to hunt down these animals because of this human capacity for thermoregulatory control. So what persistent hunting required was intelligence, particularly high sweat rates, and ability to resist the effects of dehydration, and sodium and water conservation because this was an arid environment. And those are the characteristics that we find in humans today. So you may wonder, why have you got this great capacity to sweat? Well, the answer is because you come from a line in which we were hunters, and we were midday hunters. So when we look at an athlete like Haile Gebrselassie, who was the world record holder in the marathon until recently, we've studied him and we know that he can sweat at a rate of 3 liters per hour that he runs, which is enormous because he's only 58 kilograms or so. And what is more, when he runs a marathon, he will lose 10% of his body weight. He'll lose 5 kilograms. So he's a classic example of what humans evolved to do, to be able to hunt and run for prolonged periods in the heat without overheating and without needing to drink, so that they were able to capture the animals that, because they only panted, were unable to regulate their temperature. So humans have by far the best thermoregulated capacity of any animal. And really that's been noticed by Daniel Lieberman, who wrote this paper in Nature, and which really was the first to suggest that humans evolved as long-distance persistent hunters on the plains of Africa. So high-quality science suggesting that we were hunters and that that's what led us to become human. And the reason we had to hunt in midday heat was because of the lions. And the lions have got great vision, and they own the night. And they own the night so much that if a human was walking around at night, they will simply get eaten. And the evidence is so clear that the Bushmen today, who of course have a long history of living in the Kalahari with lions, they will not go out before 10 o'clock in the morning because they know how dangerous lions are in the night. So that was the African savanna, and the large predators were the main challenge. And we had to avoid being out there competing at the same time as them. In the cool of the night, the lions dominate, but not in the heat of the day. So then if we look at the evolution of humans, chimpanzees, gorillas, you'll see that we split from gorillas about 7 million years ago and from chimpanzees about 6 million years ago. And then there was the evolution from Anamensis, Afarensis, and Garhi into Homo habilis and Homo erectus. But the change was driven by dietary change, and that was because humans became carnivores about 3.5 million years ago. And that then drove our evolution. And one of the big changes that you see in humans as we evolved is that beginning about 1 million years ago, the size of our brain started to increase, and dramatically increased, particularly over the last 500,000 years. And to have such a big brain, you have to be eating high protein, high fat diets. And there's many questions in my mind as to why the big changes occurred in the last 200,000 years in brain size, and those will still be answered, I suspect, in the future. In part, it was learning how to cook, but there must have been many other factors as well. But the point is that the brain is a very, very energy dependent. Very energy dependent. It requires 25% of all the energy we use at rest, and you can only supply it and keep it growing particularly and supplying it with energy if you have a high energy diet. And that must have happened because we went from being vegetarians to eating high fat, high protein diets. The second point of the talk is to say that the second great change in our nutrition occurred about 2,000 to 12,000 years ago with the development of agriculture. And I'm not going to go any great depth here, except to say that we know that when we started eating cereals and grains, our health deteriorated. And there's clear evidence that humans became smaller and fatter and more diseased with the development of agriculture. We know that because of archaeological record, but also because of the ancient Egyptians. And it's interesting that the ancient Egyptians ate the diet that we say today is so healthy. They had lots of fruit and vegetables. They had lots of cereals and grains. They did not have much saturated fat. They had limited amounts of meat. And that was the diet that we proposed. Yet we know from the record of the mummies that their health was not good. They had dental caries, they had tooth decay, they had gum disease, they were obese, and they had arterial damage. And so we actually know from that experiment that the diet that we're proposing for people to eat to be healthy, if we just look back at the ancient Egyptians, we'd know that we were wrong, and we wouldn't have had to repeat the experiment.